It happened on a Sunday morning that was supposed to be like any other. The congregation had gathered, rows filled with familiar faces, hands clasped in prayer, waiting for the sermon that had always been a source of comfort, of truth, of grounding. Pastor Samuel stood at the pulpit, Bible open, his voice steady and clear as it had been for over 20 years. But then something changed. In the middle of a sentence, right in the space between one word and the next, he stopped, not in confusion, not in distress. He simply was no longer there. No sound, no cry for help, no footsteps fading, just gone. His coat remained, hanging on the back of the pulpit chair, exactly where he had placed it before beginning his sermon. The microphone still buzzed softly, as if waiting for his voice to return. Panic swept the room. People rushed to the stage, expecting perhaps a collapse, a sudden fall, something, anything. But there was nothing. No trace of him inside the building. No sign of him outside. No footprints. No doors opened. Just absence. A sudden, suffocating silence where a man of God had stood only moments before. Investigations followed. Search parties combed the town, the woods, the riverbanks. Helicopters circled. Flyers were stapled to every pole in every nearby city. But weeks became months. Months stretched into years. And eventually, the whisper of his name faded from conversation, replaced by uneasy glances whenever someone passed the church doors. Some said it was divine intervention. Others feared something darker. A few insisted that mysteries like this weren't meant to be solved. They were warnings. But then, 15 years later, exactly 15 years to the day, the new pastor, while cleaning the old pulpit storage, opened a cabinet no one remembered being there. And hanging inside, perfectly intact, untouched by time or dust, was Pastor Samuel's coat. The same coat he had worn that morning. The same coat that had hung on the pulpit when he disappeared. But here's the part no one can explain. The pulpit had been replaced twice since his disappearance. The cabinet didn't exist. Until now. And so, the question rose louder than ever before. Where did he go? Why did the coat return, but not him? And most terrifying of all, is he ever really gone? This is not just a story of a man who disappeared. This is a story about the space between presence and absence, about what it means when something or someone leaves without leaving. And as we open this story together, one truth becomes undeniable. The most haunting mysteries are the ones that refuse to stay buried. The discovery of Pastor Samuel's coat in that long-forgotten cabinet was not just strange. It was eerie. Its fabric looked untouched by time, the wooden hanger perfectly aligned with a rusted rod, as though placed there yesterday. And yet, everyone knew the pulpit had been dismantled years ago, redesigned for safety, the old wood sold off. So how did his coat, untouched by dust or decay, end up here? That question loomed like a shadow over the congregation, and its silence spoke louder than any sermon ever could. News of the coat's return spread like wildfire. Parishioners whispered in the pews, voices trembling between hope and dread. Some spoke of miracles, seeing this as evidence that Pastor Samuel was still connected to the church, even if unseen. Others felt the air shift in the sanctuary. It felt thicker, quieter, as though the building was holding its breath, waiting for him, or for an answer. And everyone, regardless of belief, felt that the story was far from over. As the sun set behind the chapel's stained glass windows, investigators arrived once more. They dusted for fingerprints, scanned for fibers, and even consulted historical blueprints of the church's architecture. But no traces of tampering were found. No secret entrances. No hidden passageways. And still, the coat remained, an artifact divorced from context, hovering between explanation and enigma. What had been dismissed as lost was now resurrected, and that tension electrified the air. Within the community, old wounds resurfaced. Families who had given up hope reopened albums and prayer journals, searching for any moment that might have hinted at what happened. Friends of Pastor Samuel gathered again, clinging to recollections of his last words. He had paused mid-sermon, looked upward, and said softly, "Do you hear that?" No one had heard anything, but in their grief, they wondered if it had been an unfinished sentence meant only for the ears of another world. Now, 15 years later, those words haunted them with a new intensity. What if he had heard something they couldn't? What if that pause wasn't panic? It was recognition. The coat's return raised the stakes beyond mere curiosity. It turned every shadow in the church into a question. It remade the place where people once felt steady into a threshold where the boundary between here and somewhere else felt thin enough to cross. In the days that followed, the coat became the axis of a deeply charged unease. The church council debated what to do: preserve it as a relic or hand it over to authorities as evidence. But before any decision could be made, something unexpected occurred. Late one afternoon, during a light drizzle, the janitor discovered the coat lying on the pulpit floor, not hanging. He hadn't touched it. Witnesses found it folded neatly, as though someone had laid it down with care. And etched into the wooden step beneath it were faint initials. SS below them, a date: April 18, 2010, the very day he disappeared. The congregation gathered. The coat, perched on the pulpit, now felt alive, a presence waiting to speak. Murmurs turned into confessions. I thought I saw him walking outside. I heard my name called when I went to pray. Nobody could point to a cause, but they all sensed the space Samuel had left behind was filling with something else. A current, a memory, a pulse that whispered, he is still here. Whether solace or dread, it changed the way they saw the empty pulpit, how they heard the rain against stained glass, how they felt the hush after a hymn. Investigators scrambled, interviewing every eyewitness who saw the coat move. Security cameras in the corridor had captured no intruder. Motion sensors recorded nothing. And yet, no one had placed it. How could it have returned to the pulpit, if not by unseen hands? The theory of a prank dissolved under scrutiny. No prints, no cameras, no motive. Even as skepticism simmered, belief swelled. Something was happening in sacred silence, and reluctant hearts began to soften to the possibility of pages in their story, yet unwritten. Meanwhile, the media descended. News outlets called it the most puzzling, ongoing mystery of the century. Labels like sacred artifact and haunted pulpit circulated. The church resisted publicity, opening but one statement: we seek truth and we seek peace. The coat remained untouched, as if daring the world to argue its presence. Interest surged, but the congregation remained divided. Cynics watched with arms crossed. Believers pressed their palms to the wood, half expecting Elijah or Samuel to appear at any second. And so the coat became a mirror. It reflected every option: a miracle, a trick, an existential riddle. But amid the mounting tension, one thing became undeniably clear. This was no longer a disappearance story. It had shifted into an invitation, not to find Pastor Samuel, but to reckon with whatever hovered between absence and return, between memory and mystery. The coat, once a garment, had become a question, and questions, especially unanswered ones, have a way of rewriting everything. By the third week after the coat's discovery, the church itself began to feel different. Not broken, not cursed, just shifted. Those who had once walked its halls without a second thought now found themselves pausing, listening for something beneath the creak of the pews, behind the hum of the air vents, inside the stillness that had always been there but never noticed before. It wasn't silence. It was presence, a presence that weighed just enough to be felt, but not enough to frighten. Stranger still, members of the congregation started sharing experiences they had kept to themselves for years, small things that, at the time, felt like coincidence. A woman confessed that, a year after Samuel disappeared, she had seen someone who looked just like him standing at the edge of the cemetery, staring at the chapel window. When she blinked, he was gone. A young man recalled hearing footsteps pacing behind him late one night during prayer, turning around to find the sanctuary completely empty. One after another, these fragments formed something larger, an invisible map of echoes that no one had dared to draw until now. Then, something happened that shifted the narrative from strange to undeniable. During the Wednesday evening service, the sound system, silent for 15 years since that day, crackled to life mid-sermon. A burst of static first, then a voice. Not loud, not clear, but familiar. Can you hear? Just those words. And then silence. Absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The new pastor stood frozen, eyes wide, hands trembling as every head in the room turned toward the pulpit, staring at the coat. Panic could have erupted, but it didn't. Instead, something even more unsettling settled into every chest, an overwhelming sense that something was unfinished. Not broken, not lost, just waiting. The voice wasn't a recording. Every expert who examined the audio confirmed that no external signal had entered the system. Nothing was transmitted. Nothing was played. The sound had come from within the chapel. But from where? Or from when? In the days that followed, the pulpit became more than a stage. It became a threshold. People stopped using it during services. Instead, they stood beside it, never behind it, as though stepping where Samuel had stood meant stepping into something none of them were prepared for. The coat remained exactly where it had been found, folded now, resting on the pulpit rail. And beneath it, the initials SS and the date, growing fainter by the day, as though time itself was trying to erase them, or preserve them, in a language only silence understands. By the end of that month, the lines between past and present blurred further. The church bell, automated for years, rang one evening at precisely 7:36. No service was scheduled. No one was inside. The bell tower was empty. But the ring was clear, precise, a single toll. Witnesses nearby described it as both piercing and comforting, like a voice reminding them that they were not alone, but also not fully awake to everything happening around them. Local historians unearthed something even more chilling. The date etched under the pulpit, April 18th, 2010, was not just the date of Pastor Samuel's disappearance. It was also the anniversary of the church's original groundbreaking, exactly 100 years earlier to the day. The realization hit the community hard. Was this a coincidence? Or was the land itself holding something older, something woven into the very foundations beneath their feet? Meanwhile, strange occurrences persisted. A Bible, closed tightly each night by the cleaning staff, was found open repeatedly to the same passage, 1 Samuel 3 verse 10. Then the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. It was the story of a boy hearing a divine voice in the middle of the night, called by name, not once but twice. The meaning was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a conversation waiting to be finished. Families who had long left the congregation quietly returned, not because of faith, but because of pull, a gravitational pull toward the unanswered, toward the coat, toward the empty pulpit that no longer felt empty at all. Skeptics arrived with cameras and equipment, hoping to debunk what was happening. But what they found instead were corrupted files, static-filled recordings, devices that drained mysteriously within minutes of entering the sanctuary. Whatever was happening didn't want to be captured. It wanted to be witnessed. And so the story deepened. The coat became less a piece of clothing and more vessel. A reminder that some absences are not voids. They are doorways. Doorways that don't open outward but inward. And standing before it, every person, whether skeptic, believer, or somewhere in between, felt the same thing rise in their chest. What if the veil between here and there is thinner than we ever imagined? As the weeks turned quietly into months, the congregation began noticing subtler shifts, not just within the church, but within themselves. Lights flickered not with failure, but in rhythm, as though following an unseen breath. Candles placed at the altar burned longer than their wax should allow. On some mornings, the sanctuary smelled faintly of something no one could explain, an earthy mix of rain-soaked wood and something older, softer, like memory itself had a scent. Then came the journals, tucked into a locked drawer of the pastor's old office, forgotten for over a decade, were 3 leather-bound books. They were Samuel's, handwritten, dated, meticulous. The first 2 volumes held sermons, prayers, and reflections. But the third was different. It stopped mid-page, mid-sentence, on the exact day of his disappearance. The words read, There is something. I can feel it. It's not darkness. It's not light. It's thinner. A line. And then nothing. The pen stroke ended halfway through a word. Frozen in time. The discovery rattled the elders more than they admitted. This wasn't just a man who disappeared. This was a man who knew, somehow, that something was coming. Something real. Something he had felt before anyone else could see it. And yet, despite the chilling abruptness of that final entry, the tone wasn't one of fear. It was wonder, curiosity, like someone standing at the edge of a vast ocean, knowing he couldn't swim across, but unable to resist stepping into the tide. And then, another unexplainable moment. During the Sunday service, as the choir reached the final verse of a hymn, the main sanctuary door swung open. Not violently, not by wind. It simply opened. Slowly, deliberately. Every head turned. No one stood there. No footsteps followed. Just an open doorway framed by morning light. Some said it felt like an invitation. Others said it felt like a warning. But no one could deny. It felt like Samuel. As though the act of walking through that door still belonged to him. The question shifted. No longer, where did he go? But what if he's not entirely gone? What if the reason no footprints were ever found was because his steps weren't forward or backward, but sideways, into something we don't yet have words for? And suddenly, the coat wasn't just a relic of a man lost to time. It became a symbol of a boundary crossed, a testament that absence does not always mean disappearance, and silence does not always mean gone. With each passing day, the congregation began to split, not with anger, but with uncertainty. Some saw the coat, the journals, the voice in the static, and the opening door as divine, proof of a miracle unfolding in real time, a sign that the veil between the sacred and the mundane was lifting. Others, though equally shaken, couldn't help but wonder if something darker lingered beneath the surface. After all, not all thin places lead to light. One evening, the new pastor, a humble, quiet man named Reverend Lewis, stayed late to pray. As he knelt by the pulpit, eyes closed, a sudden coldness swept the sanctuary. Not a breeze, not a draft. It was still, like the absence of heat itself. When he opened his eyes, the coat was no longer on the pulpit. Heart pounding, he scanned the room, only to find it neatly draped over the chair in Samuel's old office, folded as if someone had just removed it. The door to the office, still locked from the inside. The event shattered any lingering skepticism. From that moment forward, no one doubted that what was happening extended far beyond simple mystery. It was something intelligent, a presence that moved with intention, appearing not when summoned, but when chosen. People began treating the coat as more than fabric. It became an altar, an interface, a bridge. Visitors knelt before it, not with fear, but with questions. Are you still here? Are you watching? Are you waiting? But with this reverence came an undeniable tension. Because if the coat could move, if the voice could return through speakers, if the pulpit itself seemed to breathe with memory, then what was next? What line hadn't been crossed yet? What truth still hovered, one step away, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to reach for it? It no longer felt like a matter of if the story would continue, but when and how. And so, the church stood, not merely as a building of faith, but as a living question, a place where the past, the present, and something else, something without a name, intersected in the space between sermons, between hymns, between the familiar rhythms of ordinary life. The coat, once a symbol of someone gone, now felt like a doorway. Not closed, not open, just ajar, waiting. By now, the coat had transcended its physical form. It wasn't just fabric draped over a chair or a pulpit. It was the weight in the air, the sudden hush before a prayer, the whisper that didn't belong to any voice in the room. People stopped asking why it was moving or appearing in places it shouldn't be. The question was no longer about mechanics. It was about meaning. Why now? Why after 15 years? What was it trying to show or prepare them for? One Wednesday evening, something happened that none of them would ever forget. During choir rehearsal, as voices harmonized through the hymn, "It is well with my soul," the sanctuary lights dimmed, not flickered, dimmed as though something had drawn the energy out of the room. The sound system crackled once more, this time louder, clearer, and then 3 words. Soft, breathy, unmistakable. "I am here." Every voice fell silent. Sheet music hit the floor. A collective inhale filled the space, but no one dared exhale until the static faded back into nothing. Tears streamed down faces. Some dropped to their knees. Others rushed toward the pulpit but stopped short, as if stepping beyond the first row of pews felt like crossing into a space that wasn't fully theirs. The coat remained where it was, undisturbed. But it felt different now. Heavier, denser, as though it carried more than cloth could carry. Something unseen, but utterly real. Something that didn't require eyes to believe in it. The following morning, Reverend Lewis gathered the congregation. He wasn't there to preach. He was there to ask a question that trembled on the edge of every heart. If he's here, what does he want? Is this about coming back? Or is it about us being willing to listen to what he was never able to say? No one had an answer, but deep down, they all felt the same chill. The realization that maybe this wasn't a haunting. Maybe this was a calling. And so the church began changing in ways no one could have predicted. Services no longer felt routine. Every creak in the floor, every flicker in the stained glass, every shift in the candlelight became part of a sacred language. A language none of them fully understood, but all of them had begun to trust. The coat was no longer a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a message waiting to be heard. The town itself started to feel the ripple of what was unfolding inside that chapel. Strangers began arriving, some out of curiosity, others because of a dream, a feeling, a pull they couldn't explain. One woman drove from 3 states away after waking night after night with the same image, a coat, gently swaying as if suspended between wind and stillness. She didn't know the story. She hadn't read the articles. Yet when she stepped into the chapel, her knees buckled. "It's this," she whispered. "It's always been this." Local historians pulled records from decades ago, only to find more strange connections. This wasn't the first unexplained event tied to this ground. In 1925, a choir boy vanished for several hours during a rainstorm, only to reappear, dry, inside the locked bell tower. In 1971, a visitor to the chapel claimed to hear a sermon being preached in an empty sanctuary, only to later learn that the pastor had been away at a funeral. Threads, patterns, echoes, and then came the journals again. A new one appeared. No one had placed it. No one recognized the handwriting. But it was real, physically present, left neatly on the pulpit one morning. Its pages were filled with fragmented sentences, half-finished prayers, and dates that didn't make sense. Dates from the future. November 2nd, 2030. The line holds. April 4th, 2041. The coat remains. Each entry ended with the same phrase, "Still listening." Paranoia and reverence mingled now in equal measure. Some believed the veil was thinning because something wanted through, something good. Others feared the opposite, that this was a tear in the fabric of reality, a fracture that couldn't hold forever. Yet the one truth everyone agreed upon was this: the coat was not an accident. Its presence was intentional, intelligent, and the church had become a threshold, no longer fully of this world, no longer fully of the next. And as the sun dipped below the hills that night, something remarkable happened. For the first time in 15 years, the chapel bell rang not once, not twice, but 13 times. Each toll perfectly spaced, steady, echoing, measured. And when the final toll faded into the evening air, the coat, which had been draped gently over the chair in the pulpit, was no longer there. It was gone. Again, as though the very fabric of the space had breathed it back into wherever, or whatever, it had come from. The disappearance of the coat was met with a silence heavier than anything the congregation had felt before. Not a silence of relief, not one of fear, but the type of silence that descends when something sacred has passed through. A silence so complete it felt like the air itself had paused to listen. People didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply stood in that sanctuary, facing the empty pulpit, knowing something irreversible had just occurred. But the space where the coat once rested didn't feel empty. In fact, it felt more full of presence, full of tension, full of a knowing that pressed against the skin like invisible hands. A little girl in the back pew whispered to her mother, "It's not gone. It's just hiding now." And those simple words rippled through the room, landing harder than any sermon ever could. Because deep down, everyone felt it. Nothing truly leaves, it only shifts. The following morning, something even stranger happened. Carved into the back of the pulpit, shallow but unmistakable, were the words, "Not yet finished." The wood was untouched the day before. The message hadn't been there, and the grain of the oak wrapped perfectly around the letters, as if the pulpit itself had grown the phrase overnight. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't a prank. This was the next chapter unfolding right in front of them. Reverend Lewis stood before it, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then what? What are we supposed to do?" But no answer came, not in sound, not in movement, only the oppressive stillness that had become so familiar in recent weeks. The kind of stillness that doesn't leave room for doubt, but demands a different kind of listening. The kind of stillness that forces the heart to become the instrument, because the ears are no longer enough. And the message was clear to everyone, even if it terrified them. This wasn't over. The coat hadn't returned just to remind them of the past. It had returned to prepare them for something ahead, something coming, something that had always been moving toward them, whether they had noticed or not. The pulpit remained untouched for days after. No one dared approach it. No sermons were given from it. No prayers were spoken behind it. Instead, the congregation gathered in the aisles, in the corners of the sanctuary, forming circles of hands and whispers, as though the center of the room, the space where the message had appeared, had become too holy, or perhaps too dangerous. But the phenomena didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. Visitors reported hearing Samuel's voice, not through the speakers, not in dreams, but as if he were standing just behind them. Not words, just presence. A familiar clearing of the throat, the soft, rhythmic tapping of fingers against a wooden pulpit, a habit everyone remembered him having when he was deep in thought. And then, the dreams began. Congregants of all ages, backgrounds, and beliefs began having eerily similar dreams. Dreams of a doorway, not a grand, glowing portal, but something plain, wooden, old. A door with a brass handle, and a coat. Samuel's coat, hanging from the hook behind it. In every dream, the same moment played out. They reached for the handle, and woke up before turning it. None could explain it. None could finish it. Then, on the 15th day after the coat vanished once more, the church bell rang 13 times at dawn, exactly as it had the night the coat disappeared. But this time, when the congregation arrived, something new waited. A small box, resting on the pulpit, untouched, unmarked. Inside was a single key, no label, no engraving, just a tarnished brass key. Heavy, cold, old. Beneath it, folded neatly, a note in handwriting that no one could mistake for anything else. "When you are ready." The meaning was clear. The door from their dreams wasn't just a symbol. It was real, whether physically, spiritually, or somewhere terrifyingly in between. And the key wasn't just an object. It was permission. Permission to cross. Permission to finish what Samuel had started, or vanished into. But permission always comes with a choice. And the question that now echoed louder than the tolling bell, louder than the stillness itself, was, are you ready to open it? The key became an object of unbearable weight, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. No one wanted to be the first to hold it. It sat there, inside that box, radiating something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't peace either. It was expectation, like something waiting on the other side of that unseen door knew, and was listening. It wasn't just a question of what the key opened. It was a question of whether it should be opened at all. Reverend Lewis stood before the congregation that Sunday morning, holding the key in his trembling hands. His voice cracked, not with fear, but with the rawness of standing face to face with something he could not lead his people around, only through. What if this isn't about unlocking something out there? He asked. What if it's about unlocking something in here? And with that, he pressed the key against his own chest, as if testing whether the barrier wasn't a door, but themselves. And then, as if in direct response, the lights in the chapel dimmed, not flickered, dimmed. The air shifted, thicker, pressing against lungs like water. The temperature dropped by several degrees. A sound, not a voice, not music, filled the sanctuary. It was a low hum, like wind passing through hollow stone, and layered into it was the unmistakable, rhythmic tapping of fingers on wood. Just like Samuel, the exact same pattern they all remembered. In that moment, the back wall of the sanctuary, An unassuming paneled wall that had been there for decades began to change. It didn't swing open. It didn't collapse. It softened, warped, like the grain of the wood itself was melting, stretching, breathing. And slowly, a seam appeared, vertical, a line down the middle, a doorway, not built, not installed, formed, as though the building itself had been holding it all along. No one spoke. No one moved. But every person in that room knew the same thing without it being said. This was the door from the dreams, the door the key belonged to. And the realization hit them harder than anything yet. Whatever had taken Samuel, whatever had returned the coat, whatever had whispered through bells and pulpit carvings wasn't finished. Not even close. The door stood there, unmoving, but undeniably alive. Its surface rippled, not like water, not like cloth, but like breath moving beneath skin. When someone stepped closer, they could feel it in their bones. A subtle vibration, a pressure in the ears, a sensation like standing too close to something sacred or something terribly wrong. No one could decide which. Maybe it was both. Then, as if choreographed by something unseen, the key grew warm in Reverend Lewis's palm. Not burning, just undeniable, as though it, too, knew this was the moment it had waited for. His hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of choice. This was no longer a mystery, no longer a haunting. This was an invitation, and invitations can be declined. But what cost? A voice broke the silence, not from the speakers, not from anyone in the congregation. A child, barely more than 7, sitting near the front pew. Her words were simple, clear, unshaken. "It's waiting for us." She didn't look afraid. In fact, she smiled. A soft, strange, knowing smile. "It's been waiting for a long time." No one corrected her. No one dismissed it. Because deep down, every single person in that room knew she was right. Reverend Lewis stepped forward, raising the key slowly. The air tightened, folding in on itself, like the moment before lightning strikes. As the key hovered near the seam, the wooden line pulsed once, just once, as though the door itself inhaled. And with a sound like splitting earth and breaking glass layered over a whisper, the seam opened. Not outward, not inward. It simply parted, like reality itself, making room for something else. Beyond the door was nothing. At least, not at first glance. Not darkness, not light, not a room, not a void, but something deeper, something that wasn't a place. It was a feeling, a presence, the unmistakable knowing that someone, or something, stood just beyond sight, waiting, watching, and every heart in that sanctuary beat with one deafening realization. This is where Samuel went. This is where the answers are. And now, the only question left was, do we step through? For what felt like an eternity, but might have only been seconds, no one moved. The congregation stood suspended between terror and awe, between the known and the unspeakable. The door remained open, but what lay beyond wasn't a place that eyes could describe. It wasn't black. It wasn't white. It was weight, a heaviness that pressed against the skin and the soul at once. Something was there, something vast, something aware, and it was aware of them. Reverend Lewis gripped the key tighter. His lips trembled, not from fear of what was behind the door, but fear of what would happen if they chose not to step through. Because now it was clear. The coat had been a message. The bell had been a signal. The voice in the static a call. All of it had led to this. This wasn't about Pastor Samuel anymore. This wasn't just about what had happened 15 years ago. This was a reckoning, a confrontation with a truth that had waited far longer than they had realized. Then it happened. A cold breeze, though no air should have existed beyond that threshold, swept through the sanctuary and carried with it a voice. Soft, low, everywhere and nowhere. Not through ears, but inside them, inside their very bones. It whispered only 2 words, "Come see." Not a demand, not a threat, but an invitation laced with the unbearable gravity of something sacred, something terrifying, something final. One of the elders, a man in his 80s, stepped forward, slow, deliberate. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I've waited long enough." He reached toward the doorway. The moment his fingers brushed the boundary, the ripples surged outward like water, distorting the air around it. His hand didn't disappear. It didn't pass into shadow. Instead, it blurred, like a memory half remembered, a shape still forming. And when he pulled it back, his hand was trembling, but whole. "It doesn't hurt," he said. It feels like," but the sentence trailed off. Because how could he describe what belonged to a reality his mouth was never meant to speak? His eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of something much deeper. Recognition. He knew. Somehow he knew. And the look on his face spoke what words couldn't. There is something on the other side, and it knows us. The decision didn't come with fanfare. It wasn't a loud vote. It wasn't a declaration. It was a shift, as simple and as unstoppable as the tide. One by one, members of the congregation stepped closer. Some reached out, fingertips grazing the edge of that impossible doorway. Others simply stood in its presence, their breaths trembling, their bodies caught between the urge to run and the deeper, irresistible pull to cross. Reverend Lewis knelt, not in fear, but in surrender. His hand shook as he placed the key back into the small wooden box, as though to say, "We were never meant to own this." His gaze turned to the open door. "Samuel," he whispered, barely audible, "if you're there, if you ever hear this, we're ready now." A tear slid down his cheek, disappearing before it reached his chin, almost as if the air itself had absorbed it. Then, without warning, the pulpit lights surged. Bright, blinding. The stained glass shook. The bell rang once. Sharp, clean, absolute. And from the doorway, something stepped forward. Not fully seen, not fully formed. Just a shape at first. A shadow that wasn't darkness. A presence that wasn't body. And with it came a sound, a resonance, that wasn't heard but felt. A sound like every heartbeat in the room sinking into one singular pulse. A collective inhale filled the sanctuary as the shadow crossed the boundary. And as the lights softened, they saw it. A figure, tall, familiar. His coat, his posture, his hands. Pastor Samuel. Or something that was him, or had become him. But his eyes were not the same. No longer bound to the limitations of flesh, yet still filled with a kindness, a sadness, and an unfathomable knowing that spoke of things far beyond this world. For a long time, no one moved. No one spoke. It wasn't needed. Because in that moment, every soul present understood the same truth. Samuel hadn't been taken. He hadn't vanished. He had crossed. And whatever lay beyond that veil, whatever had whispered to him that day, 15 years ago, had opened the door again. Not as a warning, but as an invitation. And now it was their turn. The figure that was, and wasn't, Samuel stood silently, hovering between presence and impossibility. His coat swayed gently, though there was no breeze. His hands remained still by his sides, as though even the smallest gesture might rupture the fragile fabric between worlds. But it was his eyes that held everyone captive. They were not the eyes of someone lost, nor of someone who had returned. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Someone who had gazed into something most human hearts were never meant to comprehend, and survived it. Then, his lips moved, but no sound came at first. His mouth shaped a word, slowly, deliberately, like someone relearning how to speak within the constraints of flesh. And finally, barely more than breath, the word escaped. Listen. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a command. It was a directive. A single word laced with layers no mind could untangle. Listen to what? The silence? The presence? The threshold itself? As if in response, the open doorway pulsed again. The air shifted, vibrating like a string plucked on an unseen instrument. And then, unmistakably, came the sound of footsteps, not from within the chapel, from beyond the door. Slow, measured, heavy, not hurried, not hostile, just coming closer, as if something, or someone, else had begun its approach from the other side. Something that had waited, or watched, or listened for far longer than any of them could imagine. Reverend Lewis fell to his knees, not from fear, not from submission, but because the weight in his chest grew too heavy to bear standing. His breath stammered, and tears blurred his vision. What are we supposed to do? His voice broke like glass against marble. And in that instant, Samuel, or whatever Samuel had become, lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed not toward the door, not toward the threshold, but toward the congregation itself. And then the second word came. This one stronger, clearer, echoing, a sound that seemed to strike directly into the marrow of everyone present. Decide. A word heavier than mountains. A word that shattered any illusion that this was just about Samuel's return. This was about all of them. The door wasn't here to offer answers. It was here to offer a choice. Step forward, or turn away. Cross the line, or pretend it was never drawn. The silence that followed was no longer absence. It was expectation. The doorway rippled like a thin sheet of water held vertically, reflecting something behind it that eyes weren't made to process. And still, those footsteps continued, slow, steady, deliberate. Whatever was on the other side wasn't rushing. It wasn't threatening, but it was coming, and it had always been coming. A young woman stepped forward first, barely 20, her face pale, hands trembling, but her gaze steady. She didn't speak. She didn't ask permission. She simply reached her hand forward, toward the pulsing veil. Her fingertips grazed it, and her body jolted as though struck by light, but she didn't pull back. Instead, her lips parted in something between a gasp and a laugh. It feels like being remembered, she whispered. Like someone never forgot me. Those words unraveled the last thread holding the congregation back. A wave of realization swept the room. This wasn't a punishment. This wasn't a trap. This was a calling. A return to something older than faith, older than fear, older than the walls of this chapel. A truth buried not beneath the floorboards, but beneath the skin of reality itself. A truth that had waited patiently for someone to be ready. One by one, others stepped forward. Some touched the veil, some only stood before it, letting its vibration ripple through their bones. Others couldn't bring themselves to move at all, torn between the terror of the unknown and the terror of leaving the question unanswered forever. The door didn't push. It didn't pull. It simply waited. Samuel's form began to fade, not vanish, but dissolve into the same rippling distortion as the doorway itself. His final glance swept across every face in the sanctuary. His eyes, no longer sad, held something else now, something brighter, a kind of release, a kind of homecoming. And with a final, whispered breath, his mouth shaped 3 last words. It was time. And then, he was gone. Gone not like something erased, but like something fulfilled. The door remained open. The key still sat in its box. And the footsteps beyond the veil never stopped. The absence of Samuel's figure didn't bring closure. If anything, it opened something deeper, something more unsettling. Because now the congregation understood, it was never about him alone. Samuel wasn't taken. He wasn't trapped. He crossed. Voluntarily. Purposefully. And now, that same decision hovered in the air, heavy as gravity, impossible to ignore. The veil remained open, pulsing like a living breath stitched into the walls of the sanctuary itself. And then, something new, something subtle, began to happen. The stained glass windows lining the sanctuary, beautiful depictions of scripture and tradition, shimmered. Not from sunlight, not from candlelight, from within. Their colors deepened, their edges softened, as if the glass no longer reflected light but absorbed it, filtered it, transformed it. One window, long thought to depict an angel, now revealed something else entirely. A doorway, carved in the center, faint, barely noticeable, but it was there now. Had it always been? At that moment, a low hum, different from the static of before, rose from the ground itself. Not mechanical, not electrical, organic, like the sound of a choir held just below hearing, vibrating through stone and wood and flesh alike. It filled the chest. It filled the teeth. It filled the mind until thoughts could no longer form in words but only in sensations. Recognition, return, reckoning, renewal. A young man, barely more than a boy, stepped forward, hand shaking, voice cracking, yet somehow steady. If this is the door, then what's on the other side? His voice trembled into silence. No one answered. No voice from beyond. No whisper from Samuel. Only the continuation of those footsteps, slow, steady, closer. But then, something undeniable happened. The veil itself breathed. Not metaphorically. Literally. It expanded outward in a ripple, then contracted, sending waves of pressure through the air like the pulse of some great, unseen heart. With every breath, the edges grew thinner. The doorway didn't open further. It became more open. Reality on either side stretched, blurred, bending as though the very laws that held the world together were loosening. The pressure grew, soft but overwhelming. The longer the doorway remained open, the harder it became to pretend the world outside was still the same. The chapel groaned, not from strain, but from the weight of something older than architecture, a boundary that was never meant to stay closed, but was never meant to be opened lightly either. And then, the veil flickered. For a brief second, the rippling distortion vanished. The doorway became clear, just long enough for every person in that sanctuary to see what lay beyond. It was not a room. It was not a landscape. It was not heaven, nor was it hell. It was memory, a living tapestry of moments, millions of them, stitched together, some familiar, some foreign, some theirs, some impossible. People saw things they couldn't name. A child cradling an empty coat beneath a sky that had no sun. A river flowing backwards, filled with broken clocks instead of water. A figure standing on a hill of mirrors, watching, waiting. Every reflection in those mirrors showed someone different, someone from their own life, someone they had forgotten, someone they had lost. Gasps echoed through the sanctuary. Some wept. Others dropped to their knees. Others stared with hollow silence, their minds fracturing at the impossible beauty and terror of it all. Because the message became clear, this door does not lead forward. It leads inward, to the parts of themselves they had buried, to the truths they had hidden, to the prayers they had whispered but never believed were heard. The veil flickered again. The visions dimmed but did not vanish. The footsteps from beyond the door slowed, then stopped. And in the absolute silence that followed, one final sound emerged, clearer, louder, undeniable. The distinct sound of a hand, knocking. 3 times. Deliberate. Calm. Heavy. The air tightened. The floor seemed to tilt. And the unspoken question screamed through every heart in that room, louder than any bell, any voice, any storm. Do we answer? The knock reverberated through bone, through breath, through something deeper than sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. But it carried a weight far beyond anything physical. The kind of knock that feels less like a request and more like a promise. A boundary crossed. A question issued not with impatience, but with certainty. It knows we're here. No one moved. Not at first. It was as though every person in that sanctuary understood, instinctively, universally, that whatever waited beyond that door didn't operate on the same rules of time, space, or mercy. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about consequence, about whether ignoring the knock would mean closing it forever, or whether opening it would mean stepping into something they could never, ever return from. Reverend Lewis stood. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from the understanding that this was why the coat had returned, why Samuel had appeared, why the veil had thinned. This was always the destination, not the coat, not the static, not the footsteps. This, the knock, the choice, the threshold of reckoning. He took a step forward, toward the door. The congregation didn't stop him. They didn't join him. They simply watched. The air grew heavier with every step, as though the gravity of what lay beyond was leaking through the seams of reality itself. The fabric of the veil quivered, no longer smooth, no longer rippling, but pulsing, alive. Reverend Lewis placed his palm against the edge. It was warm. No, not warm. Alive. It vibrated with something deeper than heat, something that felt like every heartbeat he'd ever had, layered with 1,000 others, some not even his own. And then, the door began to move. Not outward, not inward. It peeled apart, slowly, deliberately, like the pages of a book being opened by unseen hands. What lay beyond wasn't darkness. It wasn't light. It was depth, endless, shifting, folding over itself like ink bleeding through paper. And within that depth a figure. No longer Samuel. No longer something pretending to be Samuel. Something older. Something vast. A presence not clothed in flesh, but in memory, in knowing. And it spoke, not with words, but with thought that thundered directly into the marrow of every living thing in the room. "You knocked first." The statement shattered whatever illusion remained. The congregation gasped, some collapsing into pews, some gripping their heads as if trying to hold their minds from unraveling. Because in that single sentence, the truth became suffocatingly clear. This wasn't an invasion. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that had found them. It was something they had called, whether knowingly or not, through years of questions, prayers, grief, and longing. And it had answered. The presence took a step forward, not physically, but in proximity. Like the boundary between here and there wasn't a door anymore. It was breath. It was thought. It was thin enough to fold, thin enough to pierce. Its form wasn't stable. It shifted, sometimes a figure, sometimes a void, sometimes a mirror, sometimes the coat, hanging, suspended, waiting, watching. Reverend Lewis fell to his knees, not in surrender, but because his legs no longer remembered how to stand. His voice broke, but he forced the words out anyway. Why did Samuel cross? Why did the door open? What are you? The air pulsed, the walls trembled, but no cracks formed. Because this wasn't violence. This was truth pressing against the limits of understanding. And then, the answer came, not in one voice, but in thousands, layered, rising, falling, male, female, child, elder, voices known and unknown, voices from the congregation, voices from before they were born, voices from beyond where memory ends. And together, they said, because you asked to see, because you asked to know, because the veil does not lift for answers, it lifts for witnesses. The floor beneath their feet seemed to breathe, and within the shifting folds of the doorway, shapes began to form. Faces, hands, places they recognized, places they didn't. Some smiled, some wept, some simply waited, waiting for the choice that was now undeniable, irreversible, and absolute. And as the presence stretched toward them, neither beckoning nor retreating, but simply existing, a final whisper filled the sanctuary. Not a threat, not a command, but a truth wrapped in a choice. Step through, or close it forever. Either way, you never leave unchanged. And the bell tolled, 13 times. The 13th toll of the bell echoed longer than any sound should. It wasn't just noise, it was a vibration that pressed against bone, against breath, against memory. It wrapped around the skin like something tangible, something alive. And when it finally faded, the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was expectation, a heavy, sacred pause where even time itself seemed unsure whether to move forward or stop entirely. The congregation stood frozen, staring into the veil, into that impossible, shifting expanse of memory, of shadow, of light, of everything they had never dared to believe was real. Some faces behind the veil looked familiar. Lost grandparents, children that never grew, friends whose funerals had long since passed. Others were strangers, figures that smiled knowingly, as if they'd always been part of this story, just waiting to be remembered. A woman stepped forward. Her name was Evelyn, 84 years old. Her voice had trembled for years under the weight of arthritis, but now it rang clear, strong, steady. "I've waited my whole life for this," she said. Her hand reached toward the veil. The moment her skin touched its surface, the ripple turned into a pulse, a wave that raced outward through the congregation, making everyone stagger as though the floor itself had shifted under their feet. Her hand didn't disappear. It didn't blur like the others. Instead, her fingers passed through, not into darkness, not into a void, but into something warmer, softer, heavier than anything physical. Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of recognition. She whispered, "It feels like home, like I've been missing this my entire life without knowing." And with that, she stepped forward. The veil accepted her, not like a door opening, but like a curtain of water embracing her shape. She was still visible, sort of. Her outline shimmered on the other side, surrounded by colors that don't exist in this world. She turned. She smiled. And then, her image faded. Not vanished. Not gone. Just integrated, as if she had always belonged there. Her crossing shattered the dam. A man followed. Then another. Then a mother gripping her daughter's hand. both trembling but steady. Some walked. Some collapsed forward, as if the pull became too heavy to resist. Each person who crossed left behind a ripple, a wave that trembled through the veil like the echo of a stone dropped into deep water. But not everyone moved. Some clung to the pews, nails digging into the wormwood. Some turned away, covering their ears, closing their eyes, as if pretending none of this was happening might make it true. One man sobbed into his hands, shaking his head, whispering over and over, "Not yet, not yet, not yet," because the choice was real, and the choice was permanent. The figures beyond the veil shifted with every person who crossed. Their faces grew clearer, more familiar, more radiant, not with light but with knowing. This wasn't just a place. This wasn't an afterlife. This wasn't heaven. This wasn't hell. It was something older than those words, something that had always been here, waiting in the seams of reality, waiting in the quiet moments between prayers, waiting in the unanswered questions that humans whisper when they think no one is listening. And then, the veil trembled, harder, faster. The pulse became a vibration that grew unbearable, until even the floor trembled underfoot. The presence, whatever intelligence existed within that threshold, spoke again, this time not in whispers, not in echoes, but in a voice that was every voice at once, a voice that shook the marrow of every living thing in that chapel. The door will not remain open forever. Decide, now. The pressure in the air became suffocating. Some stumbled forward, others collapsed backward, but no one remained unaffected, because the truth could no longer be hidden. Whether they crossed or not, nothing would ever be the same again. The walls of the sanctuary groaned, not from strain, but from the sheer weight of something that should never have been touched by the hands of the living. The stained glass flickered, as if light and shadow were fighting for space within it. Dust trembled from the rafters. The very air felt thinner, like the chapel was no longer entirely here, nor entirely there. It was suspended, between worlds, between realities, between what was and what was about to be. Reverend Lewis stood shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the pew, his breath shallow, his heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything except the voice still echoing inside his skull. Decide, now. He looked back at the congregation, those who had crossed, those who were preparing to, and those still paralyzed by fear, by uncertainty, by the terror of the unknown. He could barely recognize his own voice as he whispered, I don't know if I can. And then, he heard it, not from the veil, not from the walls, not from beyond, but from behind him. A voice, small, fragile, steady, a child's voice, the same little girl who had spoken when the door first appeared. Her words froze the air. It's not about if you can, it's about if you will. Silence followed, heavy, crushing, a silence that was alive. Her words weren't innocent. They weren't naive. They were the kind of truth that bypasses the mind and drills straight into the soul, the kind that doesn't come from youth, but from something ancient speaking through her. Then the veil pulsed again, harder now, faster, its edges frayed. It wasn't just open anymore. It was struggling to stay open. Threads of shadow and strands of light tangled, folding into each other. Every pulse grew sharper, every tremor stronger. It was tearing, not violently, but inevitably. This wasn't a door designed to stay open indefinitely. It had limits, limits that were now fraying fast. The voice returned, lower now, but firmer. The moment is closing. Then a pause, a breath, a final whisper laced with something devastatingly final. If you do not step forward, the door chooses for you. Those words detonated through the sanctuary like an earthquake through the spine. Some cried out. Some fell to the ground, clutching their heads, their chests, unable to breathe beneath the weight of it. Others scrambled forward, desperate not to be left behind. The line between willing choice and panicked survival blurred into something primal, something desperate, something human. And then, the veil snapped. Not closed, not shut, but tightened. Its edges convulsed, folding inward, the shimmering curtain of memory collapsing on itself like the lungs of some ancient beast taking its last breath. Those who had crossed shimmered, visible only in outline now, fading into that depth beyond sight. Those who hadn't felt the weight of the decision pressing in on them like the walls of a collapsing tomb. Reverend Lewis fell to his knees, both hands pressed flat to the floor. "Please," he sobbed. "Wait. Just wait." But the presence did not answer, because waiting was no longer part of the offer. The veil convulsed once, twice, and then pulled tight like a thread being cinched closed. But not fully. A seam remained. Barely. A line of trembling light stretched where the door had been, and from beyond it, the voice returned. This time soft, sad, heavy with finality. When the door closes, it does not forget. A pulse shot out, one last wave. It surged through every person, every wall, every stone, rattling the foundations of not just the chapel, but of reality itself. And when it faded, the veil was gone. The coat was gone. The bell had fallen silent. The pulpit stood empty. And then, the most devastating realization of all, the sanctuary was exactly as it had always been. Same walls, same pews, same stained glass, same cracks in the wood. The physical world untouched. Untouched by everything except them, because they were not the same, and they never would be again. Every person who had stood in that chapel, whether they crossed or not, carried something now. Something no eye could see. A mark, a memory, a fracture in the soul, a doorway that would never fully close inside them. Because the truth was simple, brutal, final. The veil doesn't just open. It leaves something behind. In the eerie stillness that followed, not a single voice dared rise. The sanctuary felt hollow, not empty, but vacated, like something massive had just passed through, brushing against the edge of the physical world, leaving everything in place, but nothing truly untouched. The walls looked the same. The pulpit stood where it always had. The stained glass gleamed in the light of an ordinary morning. And yet, everything was wrong. Or maybe everything was finally right in a way no one was prepared to face. Reverend Lewis sat slumped against the altar, his eyes wide, his lips trembling, his hands clenching and unclenching as if still trying to grip something that had long since slipped through his fingers. He wasn't alone. People around him wept, not just from grief, but from something far deeper, from the unbearable truth that some part of them had crossed whether their bodies had or not, whether their feet had moved or not. That doorway wasn't just in the chapel. It was now inside them. One woman whispered, "I can still hear it." The footsteps, they didn't stop. Another man gripped the back of a pew so hard that his knuckles went white. It didn't go away. It just moved. Somewhere else. I can feel it still watching. Heads turned. Not toward the pulpit. Not toward where the veil had been. But toward the ordinary corners of the room. Toward the door. The ceiling. The floorboards. Because the terror was no longer beyond. It was here. Everywhere. And then, the child. The same little girl who had spoken the impossible truths before. She stood, perfectly still. Her face wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Her small hand pressed against her chest. Her fingers trembled. And when she spoke, her voice didn't sound like a child's voice anymore. "It's not over." The words sent a chill that no winter wind could ever match. Her gaze lifted, not to the congregation, but upward, toward the rafters, the ceiling, or perhaps toward something beyond any ceiling. And she added, softer, as if reciting something already known, "It never ends. It only waits." That's when they noticed it. The mark. It wasn't there before. It hadn't been carved. It wasn't paint. It wasn't light. It was simply there. Burned. No. Etched into the very wood of the pulpit. A symbol. Circular. Endless. A spiral folding in on itself. No beginning. No end. Lines woven together like threads pulled tight, then frayed at the edges, as though unfinished by design. Reverend Lewis crawled to it. His fingers hovered just above its surface, but he didn't dare touch it. Because somehow, instinctively, he knew this was no ordinary mark. It was a seal, or maybe a scar, left by the veil, by whatever had passed through, by whatever had pressed against this world hard enough to leave behind a footprint in the wood of reality itself. The air grew heavier again, not like before, not with pressure, but with presence. A different kind, not the deafening hum of the veil when it was open. Not the suffocating gravity of the footsteps. This was quieter, but not weaker. No, this was the kind of presence that watches. The kind that listens. The kind that waits. Not in impatience, not in anger, but in certainty. A certainty that the door would open again. Because it always does. Maybe not here. Maybe not in this chapel. Maybe not in this town. But somewhere. Somewhere the right conditions would stir. Somewhere someone would start asking the wrong questions. Or maybe the right ones. The little girl, her eyes still distant, her hands still pressed to her chest, whispered one final truth. One that none of them would ever forget. Once you see it, it starts seeing you too. And with those words, a sound rose. Soft, subtle, almost imperceptible. But everyone heard it. It was a knock. Not on the pulpit. Not on the door. This time, it came from inside. The knock wasn't loud. It didn't shake the walls. It didn't rattle the pews. But it was louder than thunder inside the bones of everyone present. It wasn't just sound. It was real. A vibration felt beneath the skin, behind the teeth, woven into every heartbeat. A knock that came not from wood, nor from the chapel doors, but from within their own chests, within their own minds, like something gently rapping against the very fabric of their being, asking a question that had no words but was instantly understood. Are you ready? Some gasped. Others clutched at their ribs, as if expecting to find cracks spiderwebbing through bone. A man collapsed to the floor, hands covering his ears even though the sound came from nowhere his hands could stop. Another woman stumbled backward, whispering, "No, no, not again. I thought it was done. It's supposed to be done." But deep down they all knew the truth. It is never done. Reverend Lewis gripped the edge of the pulpit, his fingers trembling as he stared at the symbols still seared into the wood. His lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but there were no words left. Only questions, only echoes, only the unbearable, suffocating knowing that the veil was not something outside them anymore. It had folded inward. It had rooted itself within. And now, it lived there. The sanctuary lights dimmed, not like flickering electricity, but like the room itself was breathing. With every exhale, the air thinned. With every inhale, it grew heavy again. And layered within that breath was the faintest sound, like whispering. Not voices, not language, just movement, as if something massive had settled into the rafters of reality itself. Waiting, coiled, watching. And then, the knock came again. Louder, clearer. Are you ready? No one spoke. No one moved. Because now they understood. The door didn't open to a place. The veil didn't lead somewhere distant. It led inward. The knock wasn't asking if they were ready to cross some cosmic threshold. It was asking if they were ready to face themselves. The forgotten memories. The unanswered prayers. The wounds they'd buried so deep, they forgot they were still bleeding. The pieces of their souls left unfinished, untended, unseen. Because the veil had never really been about Samuel. It had never been about the coat. It had never been about the church. It had always been about them. About what happens when the boundary between what we pretend we are and what we truly are gets so thin that something sees through. The little girl turned slowly. Her eyes, wide, clear, ancient beyond their years, swept across the congregation. "It won't stop," she whispered, barely audible. "It never stops. Not until you answer." She tapped her own chest, right above her heart. Once, twice, 3 times, perfectly mimicking the knock. "It waits in here now." People cried. People prayed. People collapsed under the sheer, unbearable intimacy of it. Because how do you run from something that's inside you? How do you shut a door that was never built with hinges? How do you pretend not to hear when the sound isn't made with sound at all, but with memory, with regret, with the echo of every question you were too afraid to ask? And then, the final realization, the one that shattered whatever walls were left inside them. The veil never truly opens, because it was never truly closed. It lives in the seams between breaths, between thoughts, between the words we say and the things we mean. It lives in the silence at 3 a.m. It lives in the way you sometimes wake for no reason, certain that someone, something, is watching. It lives in the way certain dreams feel more like places you've been than things your mind invented. The veil wasn't an event. It was a mirror. And the knock would always return. The sanctuary no longer felt like a room. It felt like a threshold, a skin stretch between 2 realities, One seen, one not. The walls held their form, but the air inside no longer obeyed the rules it once did. Sound moved differently. Light flickered in ways that didn't match the chandeliers. People breathed, but every inhale carried something extra. A presence, a knowing, a whisper just beneath hearing that this isn't over. It was never supposed to be over. The knock, it came again. Not urgent, not angry, but patient, relentless, unyielding. 3 measured strikes against the door that wasn't a door, against the wall that wasn't a wall, against the self. Are you ready? Reverend Lewis pressed a trembling hand to his chest, gasping. It wasn't pain, not in the way flesh understands pain. It was pressure, a weight, a fracture not in bone, but in belief. He stumbled forward, gripping the pulpit as though it could anchor him, but the truth was undeniable. The pulpit was no anchor. The pulpit was the epicenter. The symbol carved into it, the spiral, the endless knot, was not a warning. It was a map of the thing they just touched, a map of themselves. And then, for the first time since the veil closed, Reverend Lewis found his voice. Cracked, small, barely more than breath. But it carried. What happens if we answer? Silence. For a breath. For a heartbeat. For an eternity compressed into a moment. Then, the answer came. Not a sound, not his voice, but his knowing. As a flood of understanding that bypassed the mind and crashed straight into the soul. Then we show you what you've always refused to see. The lights in the chapel flared, white hot, blinding. Every window poured light and shadow at the same time, impossible to separate, impossible to survive with eyes open. People screamed, not in terror but in overwhelm, in the unbearable revelation of how small they truly were, and how infinite the thing staring back at them had always been. And then, the walls breathed. Wood, stone, glass, everything inhaled as one, a pulse like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient. The floor rolled like the surface of a living thing. And with that breath came the first visions. Not hallucinations, not dreams, memories, but not just theirs. They saw themselves. Every lie they ever told, every word they regretted, every time they looked away from someone who needed them, every whisper they thought was private, every secret thought they prayed no one would ever know. But then it went deeper. They saw others, moments of their ancestors, faces of strangers who had lived and died centuries before they were born. They saw a chain of memory, a river of human experience stretching so far backward that it blurred into something else entirely. Something not human. Something older than language. Older than thought. This is what it means to answer. The voice echoed, not aloud, but within the marrow of every person present. This is what knocks. This is what waits. This is what listens when no one else does. The spiral on the pulpit glowed, soft at first, then brighter. Its lines shifted, rearranged themselves. No longer an endless knot. Now it was a doorway opening inward. And the final truth flooded in. A truth so sharp it hurt to carry. The veil isn't something you cross once. It's something that follows you. It opens when you least expect it. When your breath catches in the dark. When the silence feels too heavy. When your own reflection feels wrong. When a knock comes, and you realize it's coming from inside. It always was. And so, the veil closed. Or maybe it never truly did. Because what happened inside that chapel was never about the pulpit, the coat, or even the man who vanished 15 years ago. This was never just about a mystery written in time. It was a mirror held up to everyone who stood before it. A reflection of something humanity spends a lifetime trying to forget, that the unknown isn't out there. It's here, inside, waiting in the questions we silence, waiting in the corners we refuse to look at, waiting behind every quiet knock we pretend not to hear. The truth revealed itself in the most devastating way possible. The veil was never a boundary to be crossed once. It was a presence, a companion, something that follows, something that lingers. Because once you've seen it, once you've felt it breathing on the other side of your fear, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to pretending that reality is simple, that silence is empty, or that every unanswered question is just coincidence. That chapel may have returned to normal. The walls, the pews, the windows, everything exactly as it was. But no one inside would ever be the same again. Because the veil did what it always does. It left something behind. A question that never stops echoing. A weight that never fully leaves the chest. And a knowing that some doors don't stay closed forever. Some doors were never meant to. And now, maybe the most unsettling question is the one that refuses to go away. What if the knock doesn't belong to that chapel anymore? What if it belongs to you? What if, somewhere deep inside the silence of your own life, when the world grows quiet, you hear it too? Faint, measured, steady. 3 knocks, asking you the same thing it's always asked anyone brave enough to listen. Are you ready? If this story unsettled something inside you, if it stirred a question you weren't expecting, then you're exactly where you were meant to be. Stay connected. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that push beyond the ordinary. Leave a like if this resonated deep within. And share in the comments. Have you ever heard it? The knock. The silence that isn't empty. The thing that waits in the spaces between. Let's talk about it before the knock comes again.